go ahead and get started since I'm sure we have plenty to talk about and I want to make sure we have as much time as possible. So I want to say welcome to everybody for the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness seminar on work and happiness. We have George Ward, who's graciously agreed to speak with us today. He's a behavioral scientist at the MIT Sloan School of Management, which is kind of an interesting place for a behavioral scientist who studies happiness to be. His research lies at the intersection of economics and psychology and focuses primarily on the study of human happiness and well-being. He has previously studied asymmetric well-being effects of positive and negative economic growth, happiness in the workplace, and the relationship between subjective well-being and voting behavior. He is a co-author of the book, The Origins of Happiness, which I have on my bookshelf. It is actually worth looking at. The Science of Wellbeing Over the Life course, published by Princeton University Press. The book seeks to revolutionize how we think about human priorities, promote public policy changes based on what really matters to people. I will say actually that I came across George's work for the first time in the World Happiness Reports. He is a co-author on some of the chapters, and particularly the one on work and happiness in those World Happiness Reports. Those are pretty influential reports that come out every year on sort of what we know about happiness in the world. So really delighted to have George with us to speak. I will say that if you have questions, we're really interested to hear them. You should put them in the chat box and we will collect them, and we're gonna try to leave some time at the end of the talk to have some Q&A and discussion. If you have a question that's kind of a clarifying issue and you're just like, wait, I just need you to answer a question about this slide, you can send it to the chat box and I can ask George if he can clarify, but otherwise I would say hold the question. Well, put them all in the chat box as you have them and I'll sort of share them with George at the end of the talk. And I think that's all I'm going to say. So welcome, and it's all you, George.
So, thank you very much. I don't think I need to introduce myself. That was very, very thorough. As you said, I've done work in sort of various fields related to happiness and well-being, one of which is sort of voting behavior, another which is sort of economic growth, both of which are not that relevant here. What I'm going to do is sort of focus on my work on happiness in the workplace. The brief I sort of got, and I'm happy to sort of diverge from this when it gets to the Q&A if you want to ask other things, but the brief I got was to try and talk about work and employment, how that relates to subjective well-being, and in particular try and draw out some interesting and important things for policymaking, in particular economic policy. So that's what I'm going to do. These kind of talks can go one of two ways. I think either you can present one study in a great deal of depth, which is frankly what I'm more used to doing, or you can sort of take a more collage approach of bringing together several different papers on one topic, and I'm going to go for that second approach today, focus it around the theme of workplace happiness, and bring in findings from a range of different studies that I've been involved in, and also bring in some studies that I haven't been involved with, but I think are still very important to know here. Let me see if this works. So what I'm going to do is split it into sections. First of all, I'm going to talk about employment status and happiness. So this is really the sort of being employed, not being unemployed, not being unemployed, being employed, self-employment, part-time employment, and so on, and how that relates to happiness and well-being. And I'll say a little bit more when I get there about what I mean by happiness. I think that's usually the sort of important first step. I would think within this forum, you guys should be used to talking about happiness, so I'll perhaps skip over that, but just to be super clear. And then going to talk about unemployment dynamics. So it's not just being employed or unemployed, it's how does this work over time compared to other people. And I'm going to try and draw out some real policy implications there. And then I'm going to move on from job quantity to job quality. We talk so much about job quantity, and particularly when we talk about the work of the future, the effects of sort of mechanization, technology, how that's all going to play. Most of the discussion, unfortunately, tends to be on quantity. It's, how many jobs are going to be lost, how many are created, and we often lose sight of the issue of job quality. So what is it about these jobs that affect well-being? And now I'm going to try and draw on some data to explain what best predicts job satisfaction and life satisfaction using workplace data. And then if I have time, I'm going to very briefly talk about the downstream effects of workplace well-being. That's not going to be at all the focus of the talk, but I want to sort of draw it out as an important facet of this work. A lot of the time, we're always talking about what explains workplace well-being, what causes it or predicts it, and we kind of lose sight of the flip side of the coin, which is are there objective benefits to workplace happiness? What does if we make workers happier or indeed less happy, what are the downstream effects of that going to be? And I'm going to draw on a little bit of my work related to workplace well-being and productivity. So, as I said, I'm going to start off with the importance of employment. This is sort of the most widely studied questions in the economics of happiness. You might imagine that once the study of well-being and happiness got into economics, you would have thought that might have largely been populated by health economists. That would kind of make sense, I think. But kind of interestingly, for whatever reason, historical, certain individuals or whatever, most of the work in economics on happiness has been in labor economics. So people studying employment and work, particularly influential people like Andrew Oswald, Andrew Clark, Richard Layard, and many others, Alan Kruger, who really sort of worked on this. And so we actually know quite a lot about the relationship between employment and well-being. And I'm going to talk a little bit of my own work, but obviously that's also, a lot of these findings are not purely my own findings. It's built on a huge literature, which has great import for policy, I think. So I'm going to start with something that I think probably shouldn't convince you that much, but I think it's best to start with some descriptives and then work up to something more convincing. This is just the basic response when you ask people in a large German survey, how important is work for your overall sense of well-being? And here we find the vast majority of people say very important or important. Now, of course, we can't really end the talk there and say, oh, having a job's important. People say so. But that's just to give you an idea of people's sense when you ask them themselves how important they think work is. And that makes sense, right? Because people spend huge amounts of time of their waking hours working. It's kind of the main activity people do, that together with sleep, and forms a large part of people's identity, what they do with their lives. So work is central to people's lives. That's the thing I wanted to bring out there. Perhaps a little bit more convincing is if we ask, what's the difference in subjective well-being between employed people and unemployed people? Here I'm just showing the raw data. I'm not, we'll get in a minute to sort of conditioning on various covariates like income, education, and looking at longitudinal data and all sorts of other things. But I just want to start with the raw difference. This is using US data, the Gallup Daily Poll, which is about 2 million people have responded to this over the past few years. So we have this big treasure trove of data on subjective well-being and much else. Just a little word about what I mean by subjective well-being here. I'm largely going to talk about life evaluation, which here is measured using the Cantrell ladder, which asks people to think about how they think their life is going overall. It's what you call an evaluative measure of subjective well-being. You can think of it as similar, but it's not exactly the same as life satisfaction, but it's in that ballpark. And then we can also think about more hedonic or affective or experience measures of well-being, which is more the extent to which you experience positive and negative emotions day to day. And that's measured in the Gallup Daily Poll. And I'm going to show some results from the Gallup World Poll later on, which is measured the same. Here, they're asking people a bunch of different questions about the emotions they experienced yesterday. And I'm just going to add them up and create an index of positive and negative affect. For the sort of sake of time and ease in this presentation, I am going to show a bunch of findings on positive and negative affect, but in terms of discussing the findings, I'm going to focus a little bit more on life evaluation, just to kind of, it can get quite dull if I say this is the life evaluation result and then say, and it's the same for positive affect and it's the opposite for negative affect. Where there are important differences, I will draw them out and show them. But a lot of the time, these things are going in the same And if we want to get more into the sort of the weeds of the differences, we can by all means do so in the Q&A. So the key thing to take from this slide really is just the perhaps unsurprising finding that the unemployed are much less happy than the employed. That I would imagine not going to surprise you in the raw data. The thing here is the size of the difference. This is in the US data. The difference between the two groups is well over 1 point on a 0 to 10 scale. The standard deviation of the scale is about 1.9. So we're really into sort of well over half a standard deviation difference, which if you sort of work in the subjective well-being literature and you look at the predictors of well-being, various different things, income, education, gender, all of these predictors, you have to take it from me that this is very big. This is really one of the biggest and most well-documented impacts on happiness is being unemployed. Now we can see that again for positive and negative affect. As I say, I'm not going to go through in great detail, but it's big. Now that was raw data, just the differences. So we were sort of abstracting in two ways, right? We're just looking at the employed and the unemployed, and we're also not conditioning on anything else. Here, I sort of break that out on both fronts. And I'm going to look not just at the difference between unemployed and employed, break it out into different employment statuses. And also here, I'm going to control for things like income, education, age, marital status, and so on. So there's various things I want to bring out here. First is, again, looking at the unemployed coefficients. Everything here on the sort of dependent variables are standardized. So they have a mean of 0, standard deviation of 1. You can see here, in terms of life evaluation for men, the unemployed are about half a standard deviation less happy with their lives. And that, importantly here, just I don't want to sort of sound like a broken record, but I think it is important just to sort of reinforce this, is that this is controlling for income and education and a bunch of other things. So the point to take here is that the negative effects, and I say the word effects, it's really an association here, and I'm going to, for the sake of sounding more natural in English, I'm going to say effect, but bear that in mind, and we're going to get to some more causal evidence later on. This is the effect of unemployment really goes a long way over and above just the loss of income. It's difficult to tease out in more quantitative data, but there's good qualitative evidence that really looks at the lives of the unemployed, and really there's a huge amount of things beyond just having an income that are important. Things like having a routine, social connections at work, a sense of purpose, and a whole range of things. But the key thing I want to draw here is that this goes a long way beyond income. The second thing I think is interesting here is look at part-time work. Here we often talk about just part-time workers versus full-time workers. The interesting thing about this data is they break down the part-time into part-time, but do you want more hours or do you not? And you really find completely opposite things, which again might not surprise you, but I think it's still important to know that people who are part-time voluntarily are actually happier than people who are full-time employed. But there's actually quite a large group and a growing group of people who are employed part-time, and they're classified as part-time workers, but they actually want to be full-time workers. So when we're talking about, in policy terms, about the problems of unemployment, which are big, particularly in well-being terms, there's also this extra issue of underemployment, which sometimes gets overlooked. There's a bunch of people who have a job, but they really don't have the hours they want. So that was using US data. We can also look at the Gallup World Poll, which I think this is, I don't want to get the number wrong, 165 countries over 10, 11 years or so. They started in around 2007, 2008. And each year they ask a large nationally representative sample in a whole range of countries across the world. They ask similar questions on well-being, and we also have their income, employment status, and a whole range of other things. And here again, we find the same patterns. This isn't just an American thing. Large differences between the employed and the unemployed. Again, we can condition on income, we can condition on education, and much else, and we really can't make this thing disappear. I said this is, so we've sort of gone from the granular, if you like, of one country to the world as a whole, which there's a whole bit in the middle there. And there are, here we can look by world region. Again, we're just looking here at the raw difference between employed and unemployed. I don't want to show you regression tables with different columns for different countries and different rows for all, just to sort of abstract out a little bit here. An interesting thing here is the size of the gap between unemployed and employed is actually biggest in Western nations. You can see here Europe, Australia, New Zealand, North America, and elsewhere. They have these big differences between employed and unemployed. In every region, there is a difference. The unemployed are less happy, but the size of that difference is not the same across the world. And you look at here, Southeast Asia, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, the difference is much, much smaller. I don't think we know, we can sort of conjecture about why that might be, but I think that's really an area, at least I'm not aware of really good research that has explored that in great detail to try and understand why that might be the case. I might, we can make informed guesses that, across different cultures, different types of economies, just the concept of unemployment is very different depending on, if you have, you can be unemployed in the UK, where I'm from, for example, and you have replacement income and support from the state. If you're unemployed somewhere else, you might not have that. So there really isn't much of a concept of being unemployed. Or it might be difference in measurement, differences in sort of social support across cultures. There could be all sorts of hypotheses here, and I think that's a really interesting area of research that I personally can't give you definitive answers on today, but I like to point out areas where I think we should know more, and hopefully someone will tell me if we do know more, or someone will do it and then tell me if they don't. So as I said, you obviously shouldn't have been convinced when I just showed you the question of asking people how important is happiness. We kind of went to this raw differences between unemployed and employed people in happiness, and then added in more sort of sophisticated models where we can control for income and control for education. But still, you might be worried that other things might be happening here. You can't control for everything, of course, and we can't experimentally sort of assign people to be unemployed for obvious sort of logistical and ethical reasons. What we can do is we can look at longitudinal evidence. So here we can track the same person over time as they sort of transition into and out of different employment statuses. And again, here we find the same thing. Now, consistent with the idea that there may be something else happening and people select, it might be that unhappier people are more likely to lose their job, or that something happens that makes you both unhappy, some sort of health shock or whatever, something that makes you unhappy and causes you to lose your job or forces you to stop working. There's a whole range of things that could be happening. And consistent with that story, when we add in an individual fixed effect, so we're looking at people over time, the strength of the association between unemployment and happiness is less strong than just comparing between individuals, but is still very much there and still very big. There is, as I said, you can't sort of randomly assign people in an experimental way to unemployment. But what you can do is look at natural experiments. So researchers have in the past looked at, say, plant closures or layoffs, where it's really, it can't be something that's happened to you or you being unhappy that's led to your unemployment. It's really a sort of an exogenous shock where a plant has closed, a factory has closed or whatever else it might be. And in these kinds of studies, you still find this big negative effect of unemployment. So that's the sort of the main effect. And that's important for policy if you're trying to think of formulating economic policy. And when I talk about policy here, I perhaps ought to be more clear that my own sort of view on that is that policy ought to have a strong eye on improving well-being. In fact, I can make that even a stronger formulation, which would say that all policymaking should seek to maximize well-being, and which sort of always making trade-offs and deciding between different policies and what best leads to the most well-being across people. Policymaking inevitably involves trade-offs, right? Often unemployment and inflation are involved in those trade-offs, and you have to make decisions. And if you're going to make decisions, you have to know what are the effects on well-being of various different things, employment being one of them, other things could be income and whatever else. But it's not enough just to know what's the main effect of being unemployed. You also have to know what are the sort of the knock-on effects and also the effects over time. I'm going to call that this sort of loose collection of further questions on employment dynamics, and hopefully that will become clearer what I mean in a second. The first thing is what you might call spillover effects. So we've seen that if I make you unemployed, you're going to be very unhappy. But is that the end of the question? It actually turns out not. It actually makes everyone else more unhappy as well, even the people who are still employed. So here in this regression, again, this is using global data. This is using the Gallup World Poll. Here I can control for my own employment status. Here I'm only showing you the coefficient for unemployed, but we also have other employment statuses in there, as well as a bunch of other covariates, including income, education, the same as we had before. So controlling for own unemployment status, including the local unemployment rate, which is the employment rate in your region for your age group, that still has a negative association with your happiness. So here, unemployment is not just hurting the unemployed. The idea here is that there's a spillover to everyone else. In this sort of global survey data, it's very difficult to pin down exactly what those spillover effects mean. But there is a large literature on job security and subjective well-being, and that is sort of consistent with this, is that even if you have a job, once everyone else is becoming unemployed around you, you get the idea that you're next, and it really destabilizes people and you think you're next. There could be other explanations for that as well, things like social context and other things happening, but that's sort of the general finding in the literature is that the main effect here is really a job insecurity effect. So that's one side of the coin. The sort of the flip question of that, if you like, is that if you become unemployed and I'm employed, how bad is that? The other question is, if you're unemployed, if I become unemployed and you're already unemployed, is that any less bad or better? Which I realize is not the best formulation. So perhaps let's take a step back a second and just start with the basic idea that humans like to compare between themselves. There's a large literature on income where the general finding is that people tend to care more about relative income than they do absolute income. If I give you $5, but I give your neighbor $10, you're probably going to be less happy than where we were at the start. The question is, does the same hold for unemployment? So if I make you unemployed, does the strength of the sort of the well-being shock that you're going to experience depend on how many people around you are also unemployed? And this is usually called unemployment as a social norm, if you like, or social comparisons in unemployment, and was a sort of classic paper many years ago by Andrew Clark on this. And we find that yes, there's sort of two answers to this, yes and no. People who become unemployed in areas where the unemployment rate is higher tend to experience a less strong negative shock. That's true. But the size of that buffering effect is really very small. So even though it might be the case that as you make lots of people unemployed, the individual effect of unemployment each time might be less, it's really not that much less. And it's certainly compensated for by the spillover effects and the main effects. So overall, even though there are these sort of compensating social comparison effects, the overall effect of unemployment is still very much negative. So the next question is, how does this vary over time? We know from work in other areas of the happiness literature that people adapt to some things very well, surprising things sometimes, like some forms of disability, some not. Certainly to rises in income, people tend to adapt quite fast. And if you're thinking about policy, you need to know not just what's the effect of unemployment, but how long does it last? If it's the case that if I make you unemployed and you're unhappy for a couple of days, but then you're fine after that, the policy implications are really very different than if you sort of become unemployed and you stay unemployed. Here, we're going to use longitudinal data. So this is the German socioeconomic panel. Obviously, we can't do this in sort of the big global data like the Gallup World Poll, because there you're asking a large cross-section of people in each year. We really need to track the same individual over time to be able to answer this question. And in contrast to a lot of things in the happiness literature, there really isn't any adaptation to unemployment. Once I make you unemployed, and this is, I should clarify, this is people who become unemployed in time zero and stay unemployed. We'll get to the sort of the re-employment in a second. This is people who become unemployed and stay unemployed. You take that happiness hit to begin with, and you really stay unhappy throughout. So there's no adaptation, which really sort of multiplies the what, I don't know what we call it, the badness of unemployment, if you like. That was in the German socioeconomic panel. We can do the same thing in Britain. We do it in Australia. Australia, this is using the HILDA data, which is the Australian Household Panel, which is much smaller data. It's been going for less time, so the estimates are much less precise. But overall, the findings are consistent that people do not adapt very much to unemployment. So if we don't adapt when we become unemployed and stay unemployed, what about if you get a job again? It might be the case that you sort of are unemployed for a year, you're unhappy, but you get a job again and you're fine. It actually turns out that there are scarring effects to unemployment. So even after you regain unemployment, you're still not as happy as you would have been at the start. Here we, this is from the book, The Origins of Happiness, using the household panel data from the UK, Germany, and Australia. We put in the equation unemployment in time t. So this is, as you're answering the survey, you obviously, here we find the unemployed are less happy. But we can also, as well as controlling for things like income and everything else, we can control for a further variable, which is what percentage of the past 10 years have you been unemployed? And just when looking at the employed, the experience of past unemployment still has a continuing negative effect on unemployment. And this is typically called a scarring effect in literature. So that's sort of the quantity aspect of this, if you like. That's the main effect of unemployment and other job status states, and the dynamics of employment and unemployment. There's a great deal more sort of secondary findings. We can talk about that in the Q&A, differences across sort of occupations and genders and time and space. There's all sorts of fascinating things to go into, but I wanted to give a sort of broad overview there. But what I want to point out there is that that's the quantity issue. But there's also a huge issue of quality. Even though the employed are generally happier than the unemployed, there's still a lot of variation among the employed in how happy they are and how satisfied they are with their jobs. And if our aim or objective as policymakers is to improve well-being, obviously one key place to start is to try to reduce unemployment as much as possible. And when it comes to trade-offs in policymaking, to really prioritize employment, keep people in jobs. We're also going to have to think about other ways to improve job quality. And there, if we're going to do that, we have to know what explains job satisfaction and happiness in the workplace in general. That's the only way we can sort of start, and then we can try and think of interventions, a way to improve. The first thing I want to, before I sort of get into that evidence, is just make the basic point, which perhaps won't surprise you, is that most people are not happy in their work. This is time use data, this is not mine, using the American Time Use Survey and a French Time Use Survey. Here, I won't go into exactly what the U index means, but I suspect people will have come across it in this room before. It's really, you can think of it as a measure of the percentage of time spent in activity in which you experience negative emotions, in which the negative emotions are dominating your emotional experience. So you can think of it just as an unhappiness index, if you like. The higher, the more unhappy. And you find in both France and the US, work is the activity in which people are most unhappy. Now that's bad in itself, but it's even worse when you consider that work is also the activity that people do most of the time. Right? It's the biggest activity and the worst activity, which is a very unfortunate combination. So that's just wanted to make the basic point that this is an area that's where there are huge gains to be made. Right? People are generally unhappy in their work. Here's a place where we can really try to improve things. It's not like people are very happy already and we're just trying to put a cherry on top and can we make them more happy? There's really a lot of unhappiness in the workplace. And we need to understand what's driving that, and if there are ways to improve that, and preferably ways that can improve that whilst also not conflicting with other goals that people have in businesses. We can talk about other things about this graph that are interesting as well, perhaps another time. French people tend to spend double the time that US people spend eating per day, but anyway. So let's just think about the question, what explains job satisfaction? First of all, I wanted to make the basic point that job satisfaction varies a lot. You can look at variation across industries, across different demographics and so on. I'm not going to sort of go through that and just make the point. Here I thought it was most interesting. Everyone loves a map. So I thought I would plot job satisfaction across counties in the US. This is again using the Gallup Daily poll. The question here is a binary question. Are you satisfied with your job? And I look at the average saying yes in each county. And here we find a lot of variation across space. In some counties you have, barely 2/3 saying yes, and in some counties you have almost everyone saying yes, they're satisfied with their job. Of course, these measures are going to be slightly noisy in some of these counties that have small number of respondents. And of course, with any county map in the US is always the complication that the largest spaces tend to have the smallest number of people in. So you can get lost a little bit here. The interesting thing is that it varies a lot across space, and not in the way that you would typically think it might, which is interesting. There are areas here that you normally think of as quite happy areas, particularly sort of Southern California, that do very well on other happiness measures. On job satisfaction, aren't doing that. So we can turn now to large-scale survey data. Here I'm going to use the International Social Survey Program, the 2015 module, in which they included a whole range of questions on job satisfaction and workplace characteristics. We can also do it. This is from a book chapter that I wrote with some colleagues called "What Makes for a Good Job." We've also done other work using the European Social Survey, which similarly asks people about their life satisfaction, positive affect, and a bunch of things about their work. The key thing here is we want to know how happy people are, either with life as a whole or with their job. And we want to know a bunch of things about, preferably objective sort of facts about their kinds of work. How many hours do you work? What do you get paid? Do you have autonomy? Does your work conflict with your life? How do you get on with your colleagues, and so on and so forth? And we want to know really what best predicts job satisfaction. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, in labor economics, generally, we think of the key sort of things about a job are hours, pay, security, and opportunities for advancement. That's what traditionally has been focused on. And that's not wholly wrong. We do find that pay is an important predictor of job satisfaction, and is also, if you do a life satisfaction equation, also a very strong predictor. You often get this, I always think this, the issue of money and happiness is obviously well discussed elsewhere, and is sort of, I always think of sort of two camps that are equally sort of wrong. One that sort of denies income has an effect, and one that thinks income is everything. The truth is somewhere in the middle. People who are in better paid jobs, even within occupations and within industries, tend to have higher job satisfaction and life satisfaction than people who are less well paid. It's also true that people who have more job security are happier than people who don't. Same thing for opportunities for advancement. So these sort of traditional questions that labor economists have looked at are not wrong. They do have significant effects. The sort of key thing to note here is that whilst not being wrong, they're not fully right. There are a whole range of other things that are just as important, if not more important. And here we find the most important, the strongest predictor is interpersonal relationships and having an interesting job. Other things that are going to be important here are things like work-life balance. Slightly less important, but still having a strong association with job satisfaction here are things like autonomy in your job, having the freedom and flexibility to do it from where you want at your own pace, and how useful your job is. So that you can think of as a sort of eudaimonic measure of how useful for society as a whole your work is, how much purpose you get out of it. And what I should have explained before this is that we standardize both sides of the equation here, so that both job satisfaction and all of these things have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So we are really, when we're thinking about the differences in association size here, these coefficients, what does that mean? We can compare across them. Interestingly, when we break this down by gender, we don't find huge differences between the two. We can also break it down in the book chapter by things like occupation, industry, education level, and so on. And we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A, but I don't want to sort of bombard you with repeated findings. As I say, we can compare between these two things. They were standardized, but there's a huge problem here, which is these are interesting, it's not necessarily a problem, but you have to be realistic and honest about what you're doing here. These are cross-sectional comparisons. We're asking, controlling for a bunch of things, of course, how much do these workplace characteristics predict job satisfaction? But these are always cross-sectional comparisons, and you can never control for everything. What you really want to do is look for natural experiments, if you can find them, where things have changed in a firm from one day to the next for some sort of quasi-random reason, because of a merger or whatever else. Or you can run randomized workplace experiments. When I came into this field a few years ago, I sort of thought that these would be plentiful. And there is some good evidence on different aspects of people's workplaces, where researchers have been able to go into firms and change things experimentally for one team compared to another team, or in one factory compared to another factory, carefully experimental work. And you find, for example, that working from home tends to improve well-being whilst also improving productivity. Sort of training programs that induce more flexibility and support from supervisors have strong positive effects on well-being. There's been some interesting work recently on pay inequality, not just pay level, but sort of keeping the level the same, but sort of dispersing the pay more tends to decrease people's happiness in the workplace. And this is really a growth industry, I think. And this is where, if people are interested in this topic, in this field, is where I think a huge amount to be done. And it's extremely important to try and understand these things. We certainly have hypotheses from the cross-sectional data, and we really need to get into workplaces and run these kinds of experiments. Easier said than done for obvious reasons. So I'm going to wrap up in just a second, but as I said, the talk is mostly about explaining workplace happiness and happiness across employment statuses. But there's also, I just want to sort of make sure people remember and bear in mind that there's also the sort of the flip side of that coin, which is what are the objective benefits of subjective well-being? Are happier workers more likely to quit their jobs or stay? Are they more likely to be productive? Are they more likely to engage in sort of organizational citizenship behavior, helping behavior, and so on and so forth? There's a whole range of questions that might be interesting here. All I wanted to do here was just point out one paper, which is not yet published, but is under review, that we've been working on in the UK with one of the UK's largest private employers, British Telecom. This is looking at across, I think, 13 or 14 of their call centers, a population of around 2,000 call center workers. And here, the lovely thing about call centers, for better or worse, is that pretty much everything is measured. So you can see how fast people are working, so the average length of their calls, the number of calls they're making, how often they take breaks, the extent to which they're following their sort of workflow schedule, and all sorts besides. You can also track sales as a key outcome. You can track customer satisfaction. And here what we were able to do is go in and ask a weekly survey of all these 2,000 workers on their hedonic affective happiness week to week. And we're able to follow that. And we find a really quite strong association within workers over time. So this is a longitudinal study. People tend to make many more sales in weeks when they're happy. This is just what I'm showing you here, is the within worker association. We also do quite a lot in the paper, which again, happy to talk about in the QA, where we try and pin down the causal effect more clearly. And the way we try and do that is we try to exploit variation in week-to-week happiness within workers, which is based on the interaction between the proximity of a worker to a window and the extent to which the weather is gloomy outside. So we're able to use that interaction as some sort of quasi experimental variation in happiness. And again, that would take a lot longer to explain and defend fully, but I'm happy to do so later on if you want, or you can find the working paper elsewhere. So that, I think, is my 35 minutes. 2 minutes over. There we are.
That's great. Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought, I think. Well, this is great because we do have some time for questions and discussion. So I'm inviting people to put comments in or questions into the chat box. And we can get some discussion going. I will start a couple of things you said that sort of made me think a little bit. You have that finding about work from home increasing happiness. And I wonder if you have a thought on the whole COVID enforced work from home and if that's gonna look the same. So are all workers now just anyone who can work from home is super happy because they now don't have to explain to their employer why they're not coming into work? Or do you think there's other nuance in there?
A huge amount of nuance. So this wasn't my study, I should clarify. This was in a Chinese travel agents, where it's mostly call center workers. The interesting thing about the experimental design was that they asked people who would like to work from home, and then within those people randomized who got to work from home. So you already have this sort of desire to work from home. And the interesting thing is after the first round of their experimental work, they sort of asked people again, do you want to do this? And some people went back to work, and some people who didn't originally opt in did opt in, and then you find the effects are even stronger. So there is a strong preference issue here. My general feeling on, I'm sure there will be papers on this trying to leverage the COVID shock to try and answer a question about working from home. I'm just very skeptical about essentially trying to answer any general question with any COVID data, because there really is, in economics and elsewhere, we're always looking for natural, in the absence of being able to run randomized experiments, what we're always looking for is quasi-random variation, right? Plausibly exogenous shocks, if you want to call them, things that look like they could be more or less an experiment. And what that means is you want something to be changing day to day, from one day to the next, and everything else to stay the same. Which it's difficult to argue that's the case with any COVID related thing, because everything changed at once, right? So I mean, I suspect it's correct that working from home has not been good for most people, or at least for a lot of people. It's been fine for me. I'm, have the kind of job I'm able to, and I like it and did beforehand, so this is fine for me. I suspect when you look in the data over the past year, people are working from home and not finding it great. If that's evidence but I don't think that's necessarily great evidence in the other direction, right? Because there's just all sorts happening at once. But the work from home thing I think the issue here is not whether people work from home, it's giving people the opportunity to work from home. And that's a sort of a different issue. The other thing I will say about that paper is the sort of interesting secondary finding that they find that people who are working from home are happier and more productive, but over a longer period of time, they actually get promoted less. So, there are costs to being outside of the workplace. And that sort of element of this will come out in COVID. I think there's a lot of loss to sort of social capital, the cohesion of workplaces. And as we saw in the other data, people derive a lot of job satisfaction and life satisfaction from their interpersonal relationships in the workplace. And to the extent that this erodes that, that's going to have an effect.
That's interesting. I'll take somebody's got a question in the chat box. I have another one, but let me take this one first so that I don't take too much privilege. Okay, so we have this following question. If the source of unhappiness in work in the US is cultural or structural, what are your thoughts on how to change this in a systematic way? Is it even possible to do so in a systematic way, or does it require a market-based solution where companies individually have to make changes internally based on consumer demand for better workplaces?
Very good question, to which I don't have a good answer, and I won't pretend to. There are individual companies making moves in this direction that have been for the past few years, and it sort of became slightly trendy within the tech world that, you know, the idea was to make their workers happy, and they sort of had lots of goals for that. And you can try and speculate about why that was the case. Probably in those industries, it's difficult to hire and retain high quality workers. You would think in some sort of market, if you were to sort of abstract away, you would think that if those companies do well with it, then everyone would, and particularly would follow in this direction. And sort of the studies we've been doing on productivity, you know, we tend to show that happier workers are more productive. But that's not going to be the case across the board, right? I mean, these are not universal findings across any occupation, any industry. So at some point, you are going to need a combination of policy, public policy, which is going to force people to do things, set standards. And then within those sort of policy parameters, there's always going to be variation, and you'd hope that people will move in different directions. And I recognize that's not a great answer, but that's my thought.
I mean, it's a complicated question, right? Yeah, I will say, I don't think all companies are going to do it just because it's either the moral argument, I'm not sure is going to hold a lot of sway ultimately, although you hope it, you think it should, but it's not clear that it will. Okay, so next question. So it's from George Kavetsos. He says, thanks for the presentation. There is some evidence by NABE or Knabe, I don't know how you pronounce that, on the German panel data, suggesting that although the unemployed are less satisfied with their life as compared with the employed in an evaluative sense, they don't do as badly in experience measures of subjective well-being, as they can spend their time in more experience-enhancing ways. Just wondering if this finding has been replicated in other data/studies you might have come across.
Good question. Let me see if I can get a slide. Because we did. So it's true that in this presentation, I have concentrated mostly on evaluative measures to try and keep things simple. Let me share my screen again. Am I sharing?
Not yet. That's it.
Here we are. So the question is, are you talking about the direct effect of unemployment? I think so. So here, the effect size, to the extent that effect size in quotation marks, this is cross-sectional data, conditioning on income and everything else. Effects are largest for life evaluation. Negative affect is sort of second in that, and positive affect, the extent to which people are experiencing positive emotions day to day, employed versus unemployed, is the difference is less stark than how you're evaluating your life as a whole. That's true. The interesting question, follow-up to that, is the spillovers here. So this is asking the question, conditional on your own unemployment or employment status, what are the sort of the spillover effects? I'm employed, and people are starting to lose their jobs around me. My life evaluation goes down, but the extent to which I've experienced positive and negative, well, positive emotions certainly here, it doesn't seem to change that much. Negative emotions, it does. So that's going to incorporate the stress element. The Knabe paper, I think, does have that finding in the German data. I don't know the extent to which that's going to translate across the world entirely. They also have very good evidence on the causal effect of unemployment, looking at plant closures. So thanks, George.
So things to think about. Okay, we have another question here. Are there major differences in the U-score between professions like medicine and jobs like sales?
There are. I don't know about the U-score, actually. I don't have that data here. The U-score is using the time use data. So there we're really looking at the emotions people are experiencing all the time between day to day. What I have here is occupation and life satisfaction. This is from the Gallup World Poll. And again, looking at global data with these things is potentially problematic because these things are going to vary hugely. One interesting thing here is if you look at business owner, which in the global data, being a business owner on average in the world is associated with quite low life satisfaction. But if you look in Western Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand, business owners tend to be up there with professional workers and managers as the most happy, because these things, it's really the issue of self-employment is a very thorny issue because there are very different types of self-employed people. You could be, a one-man band window cleaner, or you could have your own whatever tech app, or I don't know, whatever people do to make a lot of money. But these are the sort of basic differences across occupations here, and you tend to find that professional and management workers are happier, and these things interestingly do stay there once you control for income. So this the sort of loose or broad way of thinking about it is blue versus white collar. And even when you control for income and education level and all these other things, these differences do still come out less strongly than just in the raw data, but you do find that people who are not doing jobs that are sort of physically laborious tend to be a little bit happier with their lives. But again, these are average effects, and there's always going to be a lot of preferences, right? Some people enjoy different types of jobs more than the others, and it's going to be more important to think about job matching than it is just which professions are happy and not.
All right, we've got one more question in the chat box, and then if I can squeeze in one after that, I will. Burnout in medicine is significant, affecting as much as 50% of all workers, and particularly in the current moment, I'm sure, if not more. In your opinion, what change would you make to get the most positive effect in the shortest time?
Well, medicine is interesting, right? Because this, first of all, people have this idea that it's all just about income. If you have a high-paying job, you're fine. If you don't, you're not fine. Medicine is one of these very interesting occupations where you do get a lot of people highly stressed, all sorts of burnout, but obviously it's a high-status, high-pay occupation. And that also, by the way, brings out the importance of looking at the differences between evaluative and hedonic well-being, right? I mean, you can think of, to just go back to the business owner idea, I suspect this is the case for medicine as well, but I don't have the data in front of me. Business owners in North America and Europe have high life evaluation, but they also experience a lot more stress than a lot of people. The negative emotions are pretty high. Burnout in medicine, I don't have a great answer for that because I don't fully know the workings of the medical world. I would suggest working hours would be a huge thing. But the one thing I wouldn't suggest, which is perhaps a little bit controversial, is sort of keeping the same working hours, the same professional culture, the same crazy stress and crazy hours, but tagging on a free yoga class. All these sort of wellness things. That's what I wouldn't advocate. I would advocate for sort of structural changes to the workplace, which can be, some things are sort of concrete things like, hours, flexibility, pay, all those things. Some things are slightly more nebulous than that, things like culture, but are still sort of have strong impacts. So that's my loose answer.
Well, thanks. That's great. Actually, I would agree that wellness, the findings on the effectiveness of wellness interventions have been disappointing for sure.
And they have been studied reasonably well.
Yeah,
there are now some RCTs and things, and they don't tend to.
Yeah, and in fact, for anyone who's interested in the topic, I definitely recommend taking a look at some of the RCTs that have come out recently because they're quite convincingly null in ways that I think surprised a lot of people. We have 2 minutes left. I recognize people might have to leave. I was just curious, George, about your thoughts on life satisfaction as a measure of happiness. Are you satisfied? Pun perhaps not intended. With that as a measure, do you think that, are there other measures of well-being you wish you had?
It's not perfect, but I think in terms of having large-scale data across people, it's the measure I'm most comfortable with. I tend to like to look at the effects of policy changes and whatever else on life satisfaction, and also look at emotional experience and eudaimonia, this idea of purpose and worthwhileness as well. But I tend to focus on evaluative well-being for the simple reason that I tend to think, and again, would take hours to discuss, but I tend to think of the emotional experiences as sort of determining the extent to which you're satisfied with your life. In general, being satisfied with your life or not, I see as pretty unambiguously good or bad, right? If you're very satisfied with your life, it's difficult to think of a way to say, oh, you know, maybe you'd like it unhappy or whatever. Whereas with the emotions, I think it's perfectly fine for someone to say, you know, I quite like a stressful life. That's kind of how I thrive. You know, so some people might enjoy that or have different preferences for the amounts of positive and negative emotions they kind of want to feel. But the satisfaction I see as more of a sort of global measure of how satisfied overall are you with your life. And that's what we kind of ought to be targeting is. And again, the same thing can be said for purpose, right? I mean, some people, in order to be satisfied with their life, need to have huge amounts of purpose, you know, and they can, you know, become clerics or whatever else they want to do. But some people, you know, don't find that important, and that's fine. But the key thing for me is whether they're satisfied overall. That's my view.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm afraid we could keep going for hours, but we are out of time. So I want to say a big thank you to George for sharing his work with us and some of these perspectives. Really, really interesting. I will just note for folks that we have another seminar coming up in late March on March 24th. Dr. Michelle Lamont will be speaking with us. She's a professor of sociology and of African American studies here at Harvard. She directs the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and she's an author on many books and articles looking at culture and equality, social change, successful societies, and resilience. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. The details for that are going to be on our website, so take a look, and we'll hope to see you all again soon. So thanks again, George. Great to see you. Thanks all.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.